Tonight we pray for the soul of Texas National Guardsman Bishop Evans and for the consolation of his family. On Friday, 22-year-old Evans leaped into the Rio Grande near Eagle Pass, Texas, to rescue two illegal immigrants from drowning. Evans was lost in the turbulent river and his body was not found until today. After an exhaustive search, his body was found this morning. The Texas Military Department reports that the two people Evans sacrificed himself to save were, quote, involved in illicit transnational narcotics trafficking, end quote. Evans was a 3-year veteran of the National Guard who had served in Kuwait and Iraq. His specialized training was in artillery, which presumably does not involve swift water rescue techniques. It says a lot about how chaotic our border has become that he was patrolling it in the first place. But his heroic act of self-sacrifice says even more about this young serviceman. So rest in peace, Bishop Evans. And joining us now to discuss is a writer and morning podcast host for the Daily Wire, Ian Haworth. Thanks for being here tonight, Ian.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So there's a lot of tragedy associated with this story, but perhaps the most tragic part, at least in my mind, is that the people this brave Texas National Guardsman gave his life for were suspected drug traffickers. They weren't small children or innocents who had been lured by rapacious coyotes who promised them a better life. Do you think this is the ugly nature of what's being allowed to fester at our southern border?
I think it's the tip of the iceberg of what's being allowed to fester. You have the Biden administration, which is effectively leaving the door open. They're trying to leave the door even more open than it is right now, unfortunately. And the real reality of this is that people do get hurt. In this case, it was people who are involved in something nefarious, but often it is women and children who are also hurt, and our service members who are trying to keep people safe, both in the U.S., but also people who are there on the ground. People on the border are often portrayed as evil. I remember that image of the officer on a horse that went viral a couple of months ago, maybe last year. I can't remember exactly when. They're portrayed as these evil characters, and really they're just good people trying to do what's right in the moment. It's just a terrible situation that is purely the outcome of the Biden administration's policies on the border.
And that's what I want to ask, because I know there's a lot of mudslinging in our politics today, and so I don't want to engage in that too much. But I feel like the point should be made. With this young man's death, do you think it can be laid at the feet of the Biden administration?
I think so. I mean, ultimately, everything that comes out of a policy is the fault of whatever administration is in power, whether it be the Trump administration or the Biden administration. Let's just say the roles were reversed, and that's certainly what the media would do if it was Trump in power. And so I think it's fair for us to at least ask questions about culpability here and the environment which was created. It is impossible to argue against the fact that the environment in which this happened and this was allowed to happen was purely the fault of the Biden administration. And so really things have consequences and voting has consequences. And we're seeing that in a real horrible situation here.
It does. And what I hate is how a lot of these deaths get memory hold, like we saw in Afghanistan when Kabul fell on Biden's watch in August of 2021. Those 13 brave U.S. service members, they were barely in the news and then they kind of went away. And we remember at the time, Biden, a lot of those Gold Star families said that Biden didn't treat their families too well. Afterward, he was checking his watch. He wasn't very kind and receptive to what a lot of these family members were saying. So he just wanted to talk about himself and his own family. So now we fast forward to, unfortunately, this death here at the border. I think there was a question asked of Jen Psaki about it today by a reporter, but the most we kind of saw from her was, well, he was there with Texas. He wasn't necessarily there on behalf of the federal government, as if that was a huge distinction at this point. Do you think do you fear that perhaps this death will be memory hold like we've seen before?
Absolutely. Every single thing in our media that is in a way detrimental to Joe Biden's status in office is memory hold, especially when it comes down to a human cost. I think bringing up Afghanistan is a fantastic example. Again, this was a direct, indisputable outcome of his policies. 13 people died because of Joe Biden, let alone the thousands of people who are going to die under the Taliban now. And it was just memory hold because ultimately the media serves one purpose, and that's to protect the Democratic Party and their narrative. And so this will be memory hold if it's even reported at all. I know your outlet and several other conservative outlets will be reporting on it, but quite frankly, I'll be surprised if this makes it into any leftist media. And if it does, it'll be gone within the day.
And because sadly for a lot of these people in the administration, it all comes down to PR. And unfortunately, this is not good PR, seeing as next week, or next month, I should say, in May, the Biden administration will no longer be enforcing Title 42, which was a Trump-era COVID policy that allowed border officials to return without any kind of court, havoc or anything, expelling migrants at the border back into Mexico if they were trying to cross here illegally. We know we're expecting to see a huge tsunami of people rushing the border at the end of May. Do you expect, Sally, more tragedies like this, perhaps?
Yes, I mean, the fact is that the journey north to the US border with Mexico is incredibly dangerous. You have just the natural elements, the weather, you've got the fact that you've got horrendously immoral people who take advantage of many people who are desperate. You also have the fact that terrorists and people with other nefarious goals use these routes to try and get into the country. There's just a never-ending list of reasons as to why this is bad for the United States and bad for people on a human level. Like, I'm pro-immigration if it's legal immigration and we're actually vetting people. But the idea that we should just have an open door to a country and like there's going to be no consequences, I think is just naivety of the highest level. And unfortunately, we're going to see more and more of these cases of children being used to traffic people across and then being sold back and just being used to get people through the border over and over again. What I think is also quite interesting is the way that COVID is the ultimate excuse for any level of authoritarianism. But when it comes to the border, COVID isn't an issue. Are they seriously testing each one of these people at the border? I seriously doubt that. And so it's just more hypocrisy and more lack of empathy, given that Biden ran on empathy. He was going to be the empathetic candidate to stand up to Trump's great cruelty, where cruelty was the point. And I'm seeing a lot of cruelty from Joe Biden in the last year or so.
Yeah, exactly. I am as well. And also, it's interesting that at the border, when it comes to the border crisis we've seen over the last almost 2 years, going on 2 years now at this point, that it actually has moved the needle for a lot of those counties, more blue counties where you see a lot more Hispanic or Latino voters actually turning more red. We saw that in the 2020 presidential election. Of course, Democrats don't want anyone else to know that, but actually, for a lot of these people living at the border, they're seeing the policies play out right before their very eyes. Many of their families had fled from these countries, from the violence and everything. And so we see that needle moving more toward the right on these issues. Another interesting development, I saw you were talking about it actually on social media when it comes to Axios. They're talking about the record levels we've seen of first-time gun owners here in America, and specifically among minorities, Asian families, Hispanic families, and Black families here in America, 43 to about 58% increases in gun ownership. But the funny part, though, is how Axios reported this over the weekend. They said that this could spell trouble for Democrats. What do you think of that line there?
I mean, it's borderline racist, isn't it? The idea that people who are minorities carrying out a basic fundamental right in this country is trouble for a party. That says a lot about that party. But again, I'm not really surprised when we saw years, months, at the very least, of riots across the country where people's neighborhoods were burned down, and the entire Democratic Party basically sat far enough away and applauded the whole thing. And you're shocked that people are taking their own safety into their own hands. And a lot of these neighborhoods were minority neighborhoods. The fact is, the Democratic Party, whether it's at the border or in inner cities, simply don't care about people's safety when it goes against their own narrative. And so I'm not surprised that people are taking things into their own hands by exercising their Second Amendment right. I think it's a fantastic thing. I think we've seen so many times that more guns in communities is actually a good thing if you care about safety. And so the more this happens, the better. And I think it says a lot that the Democratic Party are worried that Black people, Asian people are getting guns. I think that says a lot about them.
And I'm going to have to leave it there for tonight, but thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.